Hi, I'm Jon Byron, and you're listening to the Model Philosopher podcast.
Hello, NSIO. It's the web shop you need to know.
The web shop everybody needs to know. NSIO, it's the web shop.
Web shop you need to know. Tools, decals, files, and much more. Tools and decals, files, and much more. So don't lose time and visit the store. Visit the store. NSIO, NSIO.
NSIO.
Spend $50 or if you like even more to enjoy free shipping, free gift of your choice. To enjoy free shipping and free gift of your choice.
Free gift of your choice. NSIO, NSIO, NSIO.
Welcome. My name is Chris Meddings, and this is the Model Philosopher. In this episode, I'll be talking to aircraft modeller Jon Byron about modelling without a story. But before I do, I'd like to talk about our sponsors. Anish you heard from at the start of this show. As I said last time, I'm a huge fan of Anish, and I've been using their decals, details and superb tweezers for many years. They do all kinds of stuff, from braided lines to resin switches, knobs and dials, to decals of placards and all kinds of good stuff. If you're a scratch builder or a detailer, you need some Anish in your life. Check them out today and also see the range of ITA3 products they now carry at anish.io. That's ANYZ.io. Scale Model Challenge is the best model show in the world. Whether you're a beginner or a master figure painter, scale modeler or dioramist or anything in between, you will find your modelling happiness at Scale Model Challenge. They have a world-leading competition, 150 traders with unique and high-quality figures, models, accessories, tools and everything you need to make your masterpiece, plus workshops and arguably the best social side of any show I've ever been to. It's the one show you can't miss, and people come from all over the world to enjoy it. Check out the details of this year's show at scalemodelchallenge.com or on the Scale Model Challenge Facebook or Instagram pages. On to this week's interview. Jon Byron is different from most of the people I've had on this podcast. He does not tell stories and he sticks to one scale and genre. While this is not the kind of thing I usually cover on this show, it is no less considered or philosophical, and arguably it's actually a mainstream point of view on modelling. Let's hear more about this from Jon now. Welcome, Jon Byron, to the Model Philosopher.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me. It's very unexpected.
It shouldn't be really, because we've spoken a lot in the past, and I like to get on people who are very interesting, think a lot about what they do, and have a different point of view. And I think since the start of the podcast, there's been quite a heavy emphasis on this show about the art side of modelling and about the storytelling aspect of modelling. And you stopped me, I can't remember whether we talked about it online or you stopped me at Telford, but we spoke about this and said that basically you don't want to tell any kind of story in what you do. It's just not what you're about. And I thought that was a really interesting point of view, partly because there's been a whole thing in the podcasting, scale model podcasting in the last year or so where everyone's talking about storytelling. And it's almost become a sort of a trope really of modelling that, we should all be telling stories. And of course, most modellers don't. So I've asked you on to talk about that point of view and to tell us all about that. So why don't you start by telling us a bit about yourself and then we'll get into that a bit later.
I do think that in some ways I represent quite a large fraction of modelling. And I think there are interesting and valid things to say about that from a more philosophical point of view about why we do what we do. So a bit about myself. I'm 46 years old. I live in England. I live in a place called New Addington, which is right on the southern border of London and the surrounding countryside. In fact, this week The Spectator had a column, and the headline was, "Is New Addington Britain's most bleak or bleakest estate?" But the joy for me is I'm about 2 miles from Biggin Hill. I was out for a walk this morning. A Spitfire flew overhead with its landing gear down. It's a common sight, so I'm very grateful for that. And I live here with my wife and 2 teenage daughters. So that's who I am and where I am. In terms of modelling, I've been modelling since the early 1980s. My first kit was a Hurricane or a Spitfire, I can't remember, probably when I was about 6 years old. And I have modelled continually since then, taken no breaks. It's always been a feature of my life. And it started out that, of course, although I was very interested in aircraft, for some reason, I don't really know why, I was modelling in all scales. I was modelling in all subjects, ships, figures, tanks, cars, whatever. They were all fair game for making models. Until 1994, when I was 16. And I came across an Airfix 148 scale Buccaneer, which was a kit they released that year, and is a dog of a kit. It has a very bad reputation. It was their first iteration. And I bought that, and I loved building it. And that is the marker in the sand. That's 30 years ago. I built that, and since then, all I have been doing is making 148 scale military aircraft that saw service since 1946. I've been making kits that fit that category, and there are no duplicates, so just one of each variant. So that's my basic collection, and that's kind of evolved as time has gone on. So nowadays I insist that all my canopies are closed. I don't put any ordnance on them. There are no open hatches. If the wings fold, then they're always unfolded. It's kind of a bit like Chris Becker with his passion for in-flight aircraft. I can't go that far because, in my view, displaying in-flight aircraft is just, for me, very impractical. But I would like to get as close as possible to modelling aircraft in that kind of shape where I think they look best. So that's what I do. And my method for that is to just make one at a time. So I only ever have one project on the go. They're all completed. In those 30 years, I've abandoned 2 kits. So I now have 171 complete aircraft forming that collection.
Well, see, now we need to know which kits did you abandon.
Yeah, so the first was in 1995, was a Monogram F-14, which I just thought was rubbish. And last year I abandoned another. It was a Revell A6 Intruder, which again, it was a very foreign experience for me. There's almost 30 years in between where I finished everything, and I just thought, this kit is not going anywhere. There's a better one available. I'm going to ditch it and get the newer one. So I'm not completely inflexible, but that's been my general pattern. And similarly, I have patterns for when I come to purchasing stuff. So I'm not impulsive because I will only buy things that fit those criteria. And I think we'll come on to this again a bit later, but when it comes to what am I going to build, I don't really have any reason to build kit A over kit B in my stash. It's just I will build whatever is next. And the inspiration and enjoyment of building that kit will come after I have made the choice to build it, not prior. So I have 208 models in the stash at the moment, and to me they're all equally viable choices for the next kit to build.
Why don't you tell us about how you see modelling, what modelling is for you?
So I'm going to start very, very broadly, and this might be a little bit surprising to say something like this, but modelling has been a constant in my life for all of my memory. I cannot remember a time when modelling wasn't a part of it. And that key moment which I described 30 years ago, 94, where I started the trajectory, which I am still on, is quite a key year. I was 16 years old, and it has been a continual thread in my life since then. And the only other thing that's been a continual thread in my life since then is the fact that I became a Christian in the same year. And those are the only 2 things which are still true of when I was 16 to now in a continual ongoing sense. And so it's very much not in the same way, but it is part of who I am. And the collection to me becomes very important in me living my life. So in some ways, I can say my collection of aircraft, which I have built and will build, is like a clock or a record of events through time, a visual record of events in my life, which allow me to keep a kind of visual track of what has happened. So to get like an example would be in the summer of 1996, I was doing my A levels. It was hot. I was in that period in between, when you finish lessons and you start the exams. I was building an academy SU-27 flanker. The football was on the radio. It was Euro 96. England went out in penalties. I was listening to Salt Tank. They had a fantastic track at the time called Carolina. And these things are all in my mind. And when I look at that model or a picture of that model, I'm instantly transported back to that situation. And that's true of most of the models in my collection. They key into particular events. I was ill at this time and this happened, or this was what was going on in my children's life, or this is where I was living. And in order to keep that going, I have to actually finish the models. Because if they had remained unfinished in boxes, they wouldn't have that resonance for me or that visual trigger of, oh, this is what was going on in your life then. And so that's important to me as to why. That's why it's very important to me that I actually finish things. And I know that this is something which you've spoken about quite a lot before, the importance of the journey rather than necessarily the importance of the destination. And I've thought about this a lot. And other people have interesting things to say about it too. Paul Budzik has interesting things to say about the importance of the journey of modelling. And for me, it's critical that I finish them. Now, what makes me really nervous when we talk about things like this is that people say, or might say, well, you're saying that that's really important, and so it should be really important for everyone. And I'm definitely not saying that. I'm talking on a completely personal level. Everything I'm saying, I only expect to apply to myself. I don't expect it to apply to other people.
Well, this is one of the reasons I've asked you on, because the point of this show is not... The problem with model podcasts, and I include my previous one in this as well, is if you're not careful, you can end up saying, sort of proposing the same ideas again and again in slightly different ways. And what I wanted to do with this show was basically provide a platform for lots of different points of view. And to really, because the main thrust of this show is there is no point of view. There is no way to do modelling. There are ways to do modelling and ways to think about modelling. And I think it's really important to hear about how other people see it. And because I think although you do represent in a lot of ways the majority of modelers in how you model, I don't think it's a view that gets expressed very much.
I think that's true. And that's why I was very surprised that you invited me on. I mean, in a good way. I really commend you, Chris, for doing that, because I think for all of us, it is quite easy to unintentionally become quite narrow in our expectations of what modelling is. And I have a very narrow view of what modelling is, but it only applies to me. It shouldn't apply to anyone else.
Yeah.
There's no reason for it to apply to anyone else. Carried out, in nice social context, but
the actual modelling is just one person, one bench, one model. It's not... the social side comes with it, but that's not how the models are made, if you see what I mean.
Exactly. And what I do at the bench when I make models is an extension of my personality and who I am. I can't...
Yeah.
If you want to understand why why I model the way I do, you have to understand me as a person. The two are very intimately linked. And I think what can happen is people end up talking without really understanding the other person, and then it just sounds confusing. It just sounds like, well, I don't understand why you would think like that or do that. And if you don't go below the surface of the activity to understand, well, it's because we're different people with different personalities, you can end up just talking past each other.
I mean, I interrupted your train of thought there, but something else that jumped out at me as well is, I find it very interesting when you talk about how you can look at a model and remember what you were doing, where you were, what age you were, what you were feeling perhaps as well while you were building it. Because I have the same thing. Not with every model, actually. I mean, I know you can, but that's because your models are kind of like a diary of mine, isn't it? They tend to overlap and things. But certainly a lot of models, I can remember that I just had an argument with someone about something, or I was thinking about this while I was doing it. And I think part of that is because it is such a meditative activity that it's not it's kind of occupying you, but not occupying you at the same time while you make it.
Yeah.
So it leaves your mind open for other things to make an impression, if you see what I mean.
Yes. Yes, that's true. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective of the actual process of making it. Yeah. I'll have to think about that more.
But it's nice because as long as they're good memories,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's kind of like flipping through a photo album in a way.
Yeah. That's right. And you're right in that it's as long as it's nice memories, but sometimes they're not nice memories. Like when I finished my PhD, I became ill with glandular fever. And that wasn't a very
Oh
nice
God,
time in
yeah.
my life. And when I was making a recovery from that, I drove to the aviation hobby shop in Heathrow, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, but was a fantastic model shop for aircraft. And I purchased 3 kits, and I know what they were. And one of them was an F4G Wild Weasel Phantom. And that, in my mind, I can remember that journey. I remember going and I remember buying it. And then in 2019, when I built it, I'm keyed back into that memory, in addition to the memory of what was happening in 2019 when I actually made it. So it's kind of layered in that sense. But I would say it's important enough to me that it doesn't have to be just the good memories either. I mean, there are phases in life that we go through. I was talking about this with my wife earlier today as I was explaining some of my thoughts about this podcast, and we were talking about the importance of journey. And actually, I'll take a bit of a tangent now into this, I think, because journey is very important. And often when you've spoken in the past about the importance being in the journey rather than necessarily the finished model, I've, to be honest, reacted against that a bit. But actually, as I thought about it more, I thought, no, that's really right. And there's an inevitability, really, in a way that, I mean, life is a journey, right? It's not about our destination, because the destination, not to get overly morbid, but it is just a fact of life, is that we will all die.
It's a grave.
Yeah, that's right. And it doesn't matter what you think about that, whether that's the end of the end or the end of the beginning or whatever, that it's a fact that we all face. And the journey in between is where the value is found, right? But so I've worked to kind of like a hybrid model of it, which is, yes, the journey is really, really important, but I want to have certain markers on the way, milestones or waypoints, which allow me to track the journey. And that's true in my life. I was talking to my wife, as I said, and we've been married for 20 years this year. And our marriage is not about a destination. It's not like there's a destination we're heading to. Our marriage will end when one.
It's not a video game you're going to complete.
That's right.
It
It will end when one of us dies. But in between, there are lots of things along the way which stand out in our minds. And as we were talking, a lot of those are good things, but some of them are the hard things that you went through too, and the things that you battled through. And so I know it sounds a bit grandiose to say modelling does a similar thing for me. It sounds ridiculous on one level, but on another level, these things are a big part of what I do, and it's inevitable that they have deep emotional resonances for me. So I think that's really true, and it's really important to find the meaning in the journey. But it is important for me to finish them so that I have those waypoints, those markers, those transition points, where I move from project A to project B. And that means I also want to keep up my output. So I will probably build 5 or 6 models a year. And I know that they will not be as good as if I put the same amount of effort into one. But I would rather have 5 or 6 good models than one great model. That's just where I'm at now. Some of that comes from a kind of a completer finisher type personality, and I would say a lot of this just comes down to personality, and that works its way out in all kinds of ways of life. At work, I'm a police officer. I work in roads policing. I spend my time driving up and down the motorway, and often they will send me to a job. They'll say, you need to go to this crash. No one's injured. The road's not blocked, but you've got to go and record it. And so it's what we call a grade 2. You've got an hour to get there. And so I pootle along and deal with that. And whilst I'm on the way to that, they may then call me up on the radio and say, actually, a more serious crash has happened. Someone is injured. Something's on fire. The road is blocked. You need to go there and you need to go on a grade 1. You have to be there quickly. And I emotionally find it very, very difficult to switch from what I was doing and haven't completed to then go and have to do something else. Of course I do it, it's my job, and it's not difficult to do it, but there is an emotional tug there to say, I didn't finish what I was sent to do and to complete. And And so I just think it's inevitable that that kind of thing works its way out in the way I do modelling as well.
I don't like that. It's really popular at the moment for people to say, you see it a lot on social media, like these little videos, 10 signs of ADHD or 10 signs of autism. So I don't like to do that modern crap of medicalizing things.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there is a touch of autism to a lot of modelers. I personally don't like it when things change. I mean, you go along with it, but if you're doing something and then you're required to not do it and go and do something else, it can be quite difficult.
Yes, I share your resistance to want to use those labels, and I'm not going to go down that path. I don't think. What I would say is,
Well, neither of us are doctors,
no, that's
so I
right.
don't like to talk about
So,
that sort of thing.
yeah, I mean, what I would say is it's just obvious that people are different and have different personalities,
Yeah.
and it's just plainly obvious to me that that will work its way out in my hobbies, particularly in one which is so important to me.
You can't stop it, can you, really?
No.
Because hobbies are so close, particularly this hobby. I think it depends, maybe fishing's different or something, but a creative hobby where you're making something is so requires so much of you to do it that you can't really stop a little bit of you leaking into it.
Yeah, and if you're on a podcast or making a podcast or listening to a podcast like this, you're taking it pretty seriously already. Probably
Too seriously, a lot of people say.
you're probably investing a fair amount of time in it. And I mean, it's interesting you call it a creative endeavor, because I think that's a whole other area of exploration as well, as to how much it is a creative endeavor. I don't feel particularly creative in modeling. I don't see it myself as a particular outlet for creativity. And again, I just think this comes down to personality. And my example would be, I was good at university. When I was an undergraduate, I was very, very good at that. I went to the best university in the country. I did very well. For me, being given information in lectures, finding it in journals, and then regurgitating it, even in creative ways, in exams, was good and easy. I then stopped being an undergraduate and went on to do a PhD. And that transition was incredibly difficult for me, because you've gone from that stage of being given quite a lot of guardrails, this is the material which you're dealing with, to here's a set of data, there are no guardrails, you go away and you find something interesting to say about that on your own. And I mean, for non-UK listeners, or at least US listeners, you need to understand that a PhD in the UK involves no input from teachers at all. It's entirely you going away and figuring it out yourself.
It's basically you go do something and we'll decide whether it's worth a PhD at the end of it.
That's right. And I struggled immensely with that. And lots of us fall into that trap of thinking, I was really good as an undergraduate, so of course it's just the next step on. But it's not. It's a qualitatively different thing that you start engaging in. And I really struggled with that because of the levels of creativity that actually are required if you're going to do research well. I just didn't possess. And there's no value judgment in that. I just think people are different. And I'm happy to say I was a really good undergraduate and a terrible postgraduate. And that's that. And kits in the same way provide that for me. I do think it's not that there are sharp distinctions, but on that continuum between this is a kit, this is the box of parts, this is what I'm trying to do in some way, replicate reality. There's a lot of guardrails, there's a lot of boundaries compared to you go away and create something from scratch yourself. And I realise that there's a continuum between those two things, but I'm quite happy to sit on that end of there's a look.
You've got the place on it that you like and that you enjoy, and that's where you
These are the givens. These are the things the kit is giving me. There's quite a lot there already, and then you do what you want with that. In some ways, if I was being unkind or cynical, I could say it was a bit more like colouring by numbers kind of thing. But in terms of me engaging in my hobby, that's what I'm enjoying, and that's what I gain satisfaction from.
Well, that's something really that I should have asked ages ago. What is modelling to you? I mean, we talked about what it means to you personally, but I mean, in terms of how you see the hobby, what is your hobby in modelling?
My hobby in modelling is making a collection of objects. For me, the object is the focus and the collection is the context, if that makes sense. So just to return to how I see modelling, I mean, a couple of other things. Firstly, I do quite like puzzle solving. I do a lot of cryptic crosswords, for example. And solving problems is something which leans, in my opinion, more towards construction. For me, construction, I love construction. and that's where I spend a lot of my energy thinking about how do I solve these construction problems, as opposed to necessarily with the painting. But putting all this together, what I want to think, I think I want to say is, as you said before, I am me. I'm not you. You're not me, and so my modelling philosophy is unique. I'm not advocating anything. I'm not ever saying anyone else should do this. I think that would be a massive mistake. But I want to emphasise that because I think people are defensive, and if someone says this is the way I do things, other people kind of read some insecurity into that.
I do see a lot of people say this is what modelling is and this is what it should be, blah blah blah, and like as the common phrase goes around at the moment, gatekeeping of telling everyone else what modelling is. But I think also when people say what they do, they're not saying that's what it should be.
That's right.
They're just saying that's what they do.
Yes, right. So everything I've said so far is just purely descriptive, really. And what I want to emphasise is that I thoroughly enjoy participating at some level in the much broader world of modelling than my particular narrow track of it. You know, I've not made a figure since 1993. I built a lot of dragon military figures. And I will never make a box diorama. I have no interest in making dioramas. But last September, I started listening to the Small Subjects podcast.
That's a great podcast.
I've been to their website and I've looked at every modeler that's on there, and I've looked at every picture of every box diorama, and I love listening to loads of people talk about things which barely intersect with the modelling that I do. Shep Payne had no discernible impact on my modelling life at all, consciously. I'm sure there's an unconscious one. But do you know what I mean? And yet I can listen to that podcast and love everything which is said about it because I can enjoy participating in the wider thing, which is the same with your podcast. Most of the guests you've had on don't really model it. We're not really doing the same thing as me. I'm not doing the same thing as them. But there's immense value in still engaging with that and listening and finding out how other people do engage in this thing that we call modelling.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I listen to a lot of things that are not really my cup of tea. Like I've listened a lot in the past to the Model Geeks podcast, and they talk about US Navy aviation. And I've brought a Tomcat, and I probably will build something like that again. But it's not. Their show's very focused on.
Yeah, and I love that. Obviously, I love that.
Not really my cup of tea, but I still listen to the show.
Yeah.
So it can be interesting without it being. In fact, I think it's kind of a bit sad if you're only able to enjoy things which perfectly chime with what you think as well, if you see what I mean. I think that's a little bit unfortunate because you're not open to even hearing about anything else then. I mean, you don't have to do it.
That's right.
Just listening to it can be interesting and entertaining.
That's right. But, when I listen to Calvin Tan on this podcast and on the Scale Sprue Cutters Union, he said things about painting, which I then went away and tried to do on an ejection seat. Do you know what I mean? That was unexpected. And there's a great value in exposing yourself to these things. It's like, I watch Night Shift. Of course I watch Night Shift. I'm never going to make a tank again, at least I think so.
Yeah.
But I love watching it. And the reality is, though, of course, if this would never happen, but as a thought experiment, if aircraft modelling suddenly disappeared off the face of the Earth, I would have to make something in miniature. If the only thing that was left was dolls' houses, I would make dolls' houses or model trains or whatever it might be. There is a deeper underlying, but I can't do all of those things, and I have chosen to focus. It's just the way I am.
What do you want your models to look like when you're finished? What's the goal?
I want them to look cool.
Yeah.
I want them to be aesthetically pleasing to me. That's my goal, and that's a goal in the finish. I want the actual model, as in terms of the plastic, if you like, the materials, and particularly when it comes to things like panel lines and the detail, I want them to look as neat as possible. That's a very big goal. I want my seams to be completely seamless. I want the rescribed areas to look like they were molded that way. I want the paint to be completely smooth. That's the ultimate goal for me, but that's not the be all and end all.
Would you say you make realistic models?
No, I don't believe I make realistic models, and I would say that realism is not my goal. Aesthetics is definitely my goal, and I know that makes me in some ways a victim to fashion, and I don't mind that. I don't mind if the fad is for high contrast and high contrast looks cool, then I'll do that. And then in 10 years' time, something else will look cool and it will have shifted. And I don't mind that at all. And I think one of the things is there's often a tension, particularly when it comes to the finish of the model. And by that, I mean the painting, the weathering, etc. Because you can have very competing desires in my mind of what I want it to look like. Because I think they all look great. And so which one am I going to choose? And so, for example, Hasegawa catalogues in the late 1980s, early 1990s were very influential on me. When they had their catalogues were photographs of their completed models, and they were finished very clean with very stark panel lines. And probably purely for nostalgic reasons, that's a very strong... There comes a stage when I'm making a model where I just think, I want it to look like that. But of course, I also want it to look like it's weathered. I also want it to look like this. I want it to look like that. And then it becomes difficult to manage the tensions.
Is it the shape of the aircraft that you enjoy? Or it's really... Because, I mean, you mentioned earlier about, like, you just take the next kit or whatever. You know, it doesn't really matter to you which one you're building. You get into it once you start building. Is it the exactitude and the precision of it that you enjoy, or is it the shape of the aircraft, or is it both, or what is it that gives you the most pleasure from the model?
So those two things I think are linked. So I think primarily it comes in my mind, and again, I'm not going to defend this as right or anything like that, but an ideal of being able to make something in miniature where people look at it and go, that's perfect. Now, I've not got there, but by perfect, they mean you can't tell where the bits that were provided for you and the bits that you did merge, because someone did that with their hands, and people want to go, how did you do that? Because it looks perfect. The panel lines are all straight, the rescribed ones. The paint is perfectly smooth. Everything is neat. I suppose neat is an important word for that. And then I want to see that manifested myself in the form of aircraft. Why I am particularly drawn to aircraft is a question I cannot answer. It's just been there for as long as I can remember. I don't know where it came from. There's no obvious precursors to that in my family. But for some reason, aircraft have captured me. As I said a minute ago, it could be transported, I think, to any other subject if I chose to, but I found my lane and I'm sticking to it.
This is going to be controversial, but a lot of people say, I like to build tanks because I like to read history, or I like to build aircraft because I like to, watch aircraft movies. Really, I think that's all a bit of fluff. I think the main reason we build what we build is just because it's, to us, it flips some switch in our mind, which is cool. That's it, really. You can't really explain it, and you shouldn't have to. If you like it, that's a good enough reason.
That's right. There's no accounting for taste, as we say, and I think that's right. I am interested in history in the broadest sense. I'm interested in big idea history. I am not interested in unit actions. I'm not interested in which aircraft did what. I'm bored by that, to be honest. There is just a switch in my head which says I like looking at aeroplanes, and I like looking at on my shelf. I think they are often objects of beauty, but also at times I think that's a ridiculous thing to say, because some of them are not. They're not beautiful, really, but still they are fascinating. They are entrancing. They draw me in. And so you've asked that question about how is it that I choose what to build next? And I'm interested in this because lots of podcasts have had questions like, this is what inspires us, and photographs and films and these kind of things. And I've realized none of that makes any difference to me at all. Why I do have a rough idea of what I'm going to build next, and it usually goes with what's been in the stash the longest. But then other things intrude on that. Last year, my friend Justin Lentz needed a part from a JF-17, which is a jet kit, which I sent to him. And that now then meant I had an incomplete kit. So, well, I'm just going to build it now. And that aeroplane is not a very interesting aeroplane. But once you start building it, and then I start looking at all the photographs, and I start trying to attain that goal of making it as neat as I possibly can, I find myself completely absorbed in that subject. And that would never have been the case prior to opening the box. Opening the box and then diving into the kit becomes a gateway into being very deeply involved in that subject for the lifetime of that project. And then it goes on the shelf, and it gets repeated with the next one. So I don't worry about whether I've got enough interest to see a project through now, because I know I might have no interest before opening the box, but that it will come. And so I trust in that.
You build for magazines sometimes, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you build kits you're sent, or is it stuff
No.
that you would build anyway and then?
Yeah. So I have my stash and I will happily build anything. And again, last year for a magazine, I built 2 kits that I had no plans to build, but I already had them. So I didn't have any concrete plans or immediate plans. And I loved it. I love the fact that intruded, and all of a sudden, I'm making a Mill Mi-4 Hound helicopter. I knew nothing about this. It's not a very well-known subject, and I loved making it. I really did. And so
the reason I ask is because obviously, I used to edit scale aircraft modeling, and I used to have to build a lot of. Well, I didn't have to. I did it anyway. Build a lot of models for that we got sent through, and that kind of broke me in inverted commas from having to have an interest in a subject before I build it. I think if it's a good kit, by which I don't necessarily mean it fits perfectly, it's just that it's entertaining to build, even if that entertainment involves like fixing problems and stuff, because that can be fun too. If it's a good kit that doesn't fight you all the way, it doesn't really matter what the subject is. You can get into it while you're doing it.
I think that's true, but I don't quite fit that mold. So I find it strange with Tamiya, for example, Tamiya aircraft. I think probably whatever Tamiya release in terms of aircraft, irrelevant of subject, a lot of people will just buy it because it's a Tamiya kit and will love making it.
Same with Airfix, I think, as well.
Yeah, same to some degree with Airfix, but there's something about Tamiya, right? Like an F4B Phantom was kind of like there was an old Hasegawa kit for decades, and then Academy made one, and it was kind of moderately successful, and then Tamiya made one, and loads of people who would never have made that suddenly started making them, and you can see why, because I made that kit last year, and it is just an incredible experience to put it together. So I definitely agree with that, but I also will quite happily battle very limited run kits which are complete dogs. I mean, I built a classic airframes duck biplane a couple of years ago. That's a challenge, but I enjoyed that challenge. I'm not particularly interested in that aircraft, but I became very interested in it through the process of making it. That kind of leads still into the question of, am I a realist? Because each of us has to make a choice about what we are going to do when we do a model and what we're not going to do. How far am I going to go in making it accurate, if you like, or realistic? At the moment, I'm making a Hobby Boss A6E Intruder. And it's not a very well-known fact. As far as I can tell, you can't find this written in any book, that between the A model and the D and E models, they moved the inboard wing fences about 1 foot on that aircraft. Right. And Tommy Thomason has written about this. And once you've seen it on the pictures, photographs, it's as clear as day. But no one ever paid any attention to that. So the question for me is, on my kit, it's molded in the wrong place. Am I going to move it 7 millimeters inboard? And moving wing fences is a difficult thing. And so I've said yes, and I've done that. But why did I decide to do that? But I haven't decided to do other things. I think Barry Biediger talks about this at various points on the Small Subjects podcast. I hope I'm not misquoting or misremembering what he says, but my understanding of what he's saying is that when you make a model, by necessity, you are going to simplify something somewhere. That's what a model is. In my background as a graduate student was in geophysical modelling. We make models of how the Earth operates, things like extensional sedimentary basins and plate tectonics and stuff. And the mathematical models which are used for that are very simple, because all of the detail has been stripped away to get to the very core. What are the key parameters, the variables which you're interested in order to replicate what it is you're trying to replicate? And modelling in physical terms has to do the same thing. You have to make choices. I think lots of people do it unconsciously, but I think it's worth thinking about, what am I consciously simplifying here and not going to pay attention to for the sake of being able to replicate what I want to replicate? So I'm happy to move the wing fence on an Intruder 7 millimeters, which is a big deal, but I'm not ever going to bother putting brake lines on the undercarriage, because that's just a level of simplification which I'm happy to live with, for the sake of being able to get to where I want to get to with that particular project. So I think that question is only an individual can answer that question. At what point are you going to draw the line and say that's a step too far? I'm not going to do that.
I think I'm glad you're not a full realist, because then I probably wouldn't have said this, because I wouldn't want to upset you. But I think people that think that they're all about accuracy, 100% about accuracy, and you do meet people who say they make accurate models and that's their goal, are deluding themselves a little bit, because we all make compromises. I mean, I've met people who 100% care about the scale accuracy, the color accuracy rather, on an aircraft, but couldn't give two hoots about the fact that the canopy's like a scale 2 foot thick, and that the wing lights are in the wrong place or something. They're just, because color's their thing. And I've met people who really care about panel lines and detail and so on, but don't care about fully wiring up things in the cockpit and stuff like that. And to me, if you're going to say that you're all about accuracy and realism, it's either all or nothing. If you say, I enjoy a bit of realism, or I enjoy trying to make a few things accurate, but like you, don't care, don't go the whole hog on things that don't bother me that much, then I can totally understand that. And I think 99.9% of people are there somewhere on the spectrum between accuracy and not giving us who. They're somewhere on there. I think there's very few people that actually genuinely pursue every part of accuracy.
I completely agree with that. I think sometimes you find people saying this is scale modeling, and they put that emphasis on scale, don't they? And it's like, you should be doing this, that, and the other. And I just want to say, why? I mean, I'm sat at my workbench, like you say, it's a solo thing on my own. What anyone else, what they think about what I'm doing at my workbench, got to do with what I'm actually going to do? The only person whose opinion matters is mine. I think what matters is some level of self-awareness, so that you don't end up claiming you're doing things that you're not. And I just think, well, that's absolutely fine. I don't have to justify why I draw that line in the sand to say I am going to correct this, but I'm not going to correct that. But I do like to think through why I've chosen this and why I've chosen that. I think that's a meaningful conversation to have.
I think you can justify your point of view. I mean, the wing fence is visible from any distance, if you know that it's if you know that it's a thing. Whereas the brake line's probably not.
Right.
So you can
there are reasons.
Justify it saying it's the impression of the aircraft, and that overall it's a more accurate impression. But I think more accurate is better than saying accurate, if you see what I mean.
I think chasing full accuracy is a mug's game. I mean, I think that's a waste of time. They're models. I'm making a model. And for me, for the reasons which I just said earlier, a model is not the real thing shrunk down. There are necessary simplifications and compromises which are made along the way. But the process by which you figure them out, I mean, sometimes is just empirical. Like a few years ago, I made a CH-46 Sea Knight, which is a helicopter. And it's got twin rotors, so it's quite long, with a big cabin inside. And I was looking at all these great photos I had, and I noticed that the kit from Academy massively simplified the interior. The real thing is just filled with cables and pipes. And I suddenly had these visions of like, I bought all the lead wire, started rolling it out, spent about 2 hours looking at photographs, trying to replicate some of these cables. And after 2 hours, I just thought, I am miserable. This is just a miserable thing. I am not enjoying this at all. Why would I continue with this? And there was a bit of an epiphany for me. So I'm not really into hyper detailing. Hyper detailing is not my thing. I'm happy to sacrifice that, if you like, to simplify that and focus on other things which I do enjoy, and for whatever arbitrary reason I do value more. So, through that, I think it's an extension of personality again. That just didn't suit what I wanted to do and who I am, and so why do it?
But I think the key thing is something you said earlier, that you can appreciate other people's work doing that, and
absolutely.
You can enjoy looking at it. It's just not how you choose to spend your time. It doesn't fit with your overall, for want of a better word, philosophy anyway, does it? Of having, say, 5 or 6 finished models a year.
Yeah. So there is the trade-off. I mean, if I want to do hyper detailing, I'm going to finish less stuff, and maybe I'll be happy to make that.
You're going to do one a year,
and
with things like that.
We all evolve. I'm not saying I'm
Yeah.
fixed. Maybe I'll change my mind and I'll grow into that. That's absolutely fine. But a name which I'll come back to again later, John Chung. He
Yes.
knows how to super detail or hyper detail. Tom Anish knows how to hyper detail a cockpit, and I am in awe of that. I look at those photographs of their work, and I just think it's fascinating.
Actually, something they both have in common with you, though, they're very precise, and I'm going to say clean, but I'll come back to
Yeah,
that, about everything that's executed. And when I say clean, I don't mean it's not
no, I
weathered.
know what you mean.
I mean it's done in a very precise, meaningful, intentional way, and there's no sort of mess or spill in what they've done, if you see what
Yeah.
I mean. It's done very precisely exactly where they want it.
Yeah, and again, I think I'll probably come back to this later. But that's I am not in their league, but that is definitely something which I aspire to.
Both great modelers. In terms of that, then, pursuing your goal of how you'd like to see your models, how do you choose a subject or a kit? What is it that you look for in something to decide whether or not you're going to buy it and build it?
Yeah, the answer to that is really simple, and is that if it's 148th and it's an aircraft and it's military and it's all serviced since 1946 and I haven't got it already, then I will buy it. Which actually doesn't equate to that many kits per year, probably. Although,
I mean, it's getting better, but until only a few years ago, 99% of releases were World War II, weren't they?
yeah, I mean, in the 1990s, you'd be lucky if there were 2 or 3 that fit that category per year.
148 was quite
Yeah.
a rare scale, wasn't it?
But now it could be 15.
Yeah.
And that's, because of companies coming out of places like Ukraine, which is where I buy a lot of kits from, or those manufacturers now. So it does depend on that. That means there are quite a lot of things which I would like to buy that don't exist yet. And when they come into fruition, I will buy them. So that's the simple strategy, really. And then ideally, I would build them all. That's not going to happen. I'm realistic about that. But, it's a nice problem to have, that I can choose which ones I want to build. Some things are kind of on hold because things I need to finish projects aren't available. Now, sometimes I'll do it myself, and I have done that a couple of times. But for example, hypersonic models, because I think you had Jeffrey on the Sprue Cutters Union as well, didn't you?
Yeah,
before?
great guy, yeah.
And his company, fantastic product. But he has always been saying he's going to make a wheel well for an A3 Sky Warrior for the trumpeter kit. And I've got that kit and I've got all of his other parts. But once that comes out, then I can build that. That will be on hold until he makes the parts. So sometimes I am waiting for decals or bits and pieces to be released.
I know you buy stuff from ResKit and things like
Yeah.
that as well. So would you rather buy aftermarket than make it yourself?
Yeah, I definitely would.
Assuming it fits, of course. I know that's a problem you've had before.
Yeah. I mean, and those companies are improving all the time. I've constantly got pre-orders on with Hannants for ResKit stuff, which is coming out. And if I had all the time in the world, which I don't, I would quite like to get into CAD and 3D printing. And I'm not averse to scratch building stuff where I have to. I made an F-84F Thunderstreak a few years ago by Kinetic, and the Thunderstreak, it was their first kit, the first kit Kinetic ever made.
I was going to say, did you finish that in 2 months?
And the Thunderstreak saw lots of variations in its lifetime, and they moulded only the parachute housing under the rear fuselage. But the earlier models didn't have that. They had a much more elegant sinusoidal kind of shaped ventral fin, and the particular aircraft I wanted to make needed the change. And for me, that scratch building is nothing on the level of which you would do, but for me that's a significant step to say I'm going to recreate a portion of the fuselage just with super glue and plastic card, which is what I did, and I was very happy with the result. So I will do it where I have to, and I enjoy doing it, but I would rather someone did it for me, to be honest.
Aircraft scratch building is very high risk, particularly on things like fuselage
Yeah.
and wings, because it's so obvious and so visible if you don't do it well.
Yeah, I mean that's finished in it's silver paint, replicating aluminium as much as silver paint can. But
even more so then, either a high gloss or a natural metal finish, or silver finish. Very, very high risk.
But I mean, that's part of the enjoyment, because obviously I have set very narrow parameters for my modeling. So some people would say, well, that sounds very repetitive and boring. You're just doing the same thing again and again and again. Where's your challenge? And people don't need a challenge. Only challenge yourself if you want to.
Yeah.
But within those parameters, if you look for them, you can usually find all kinds of challenges. doing that bit of scratch building, and I've done it to get that kind of level on several kits, is a challenge. And when it works, the satisfaction I feel is amazing. But there are other things. I've learned how to solder PE parts together because that's useful and good. Covering an aircraft in aluminium foil, I've done that 3 times, and that's a journey, and that's a challenge. That's something to do as well. Freehand airbrushing skills when it comes to camouflage finishes is something I'm always trying to push and get better at. So there are always challenges that you can generate for yourself, even within quite a narrow field of modelling, if you like.
I think you get better and you get faster the more you do things, particularly if you stick to one subject or genre or something. But you're never perfect. So even things like a good, clean paint finish, level, nice, smooth paint finish, is always a challenge. I don't believe anyone that says they can do it in their sleep because they've done it so many times. It's always, you have to be on your toes, because if you relax and you don't, and you get a bit, relaxed about the whole thing, you'll make a mistake. You'll let a bit of dust creep into your workspace, or you'll not thin your paint quite correctly or something. So I think it's always a challenge. It might be the same challenge, but it's still a challenge.
That's absolutely right. And that's why I really dislike the phrase shake and bake kit. Because I think people who are good at modelling, people who are much better than me, never use the phrase shake and bake in my experience, because they understand that it doesn't matter how good the kit is, you've got to pay attention to every level of it if you want it to look as good as it could. And so I really agree with that.
That's something as well that I really admire in others, because I can get a little bit lazy, but I do like to try and pay attention to every aspect of the build, and that's something you do. There's nothing that you cut back on the quality of. It's not like you're in a rush to paint, so you just slap it together, or it's not like you don't really like painting, so you just whack a colour on after you've done all this clean building. It seems like everything you do is done to the same, you give it the same level of attention all the way through.
I hope so, but I think there is a kind of a qualitative difference between the construction and the finishing. And I don't want to, by saying that, I don't want to divide those too much, if you know what I mean. There's a lot of overlap between those two things. And I think one of the biggest improvements in my own modelling was to overlap them a lot more. But from what I said earlier about construction, and that I have a very strong vision for construction. I know exactly what I want the plastic to look like at the end. But I have a very weak vision when it comes to the colour and the finish, because of those competing tensions, which I talked about earlier. I haven't developed a very strong vision of what I want it to look like. And that can be a negative thing, because then you never hit one very well, if you know what I mean. Kind of trying to do too many things, and it leads to uncertainty. So I think I would definitely like to grow a lot more in that area of colour and finishing to make stronger statements, I think, on that side of things, or to have a stronger vision.
To be honest, 99 times out of 100, that's why I don't finish a model when I don't finish it. It's because I didn't have a vision of how I wanted it to be when I started. Because I really enjoy the building side, so I find no trouble at all jumping into that and really working hard on that. But quite often, in my mind, how it's finished isn't clear. I might have a fuzzy idea, but it's not clear. And I find if I don't have a clear idea, that's when I hit the buffers with a build.
I can really resonate with that. As you know, I do finish them, but there's always a sense sometimes in which they're abandoned rather than finished, even at the level where I finish, because especially with the very wide range of different tools which are now available, am I going to use oils, pencils, inks, markers, whatever it might be. There's so many different things, and it can become a little bit overwhelming. The amount of choice, number of directions you could take it in by the time you get to weathering, I find can be a bit overwhelming.
Do you aim for colour accuracy, or is it not something that bothers you too much? Are you more of a ballpark kind of person?
I pay lip service to it. It's just easy for me to say, this is the FS colour, I will buy the FS colours and use them. But, I think colour accuracy is also a mug's game. Because what am I trying to replicate? People would say, oh, it didn't look like that in real life. But the only access that I have to most of these subjects is a photograph, right? And the photographs themselves come with all kinds of different processes, which means the colours look radically different depending on which photograph you're looking at. So
at the bare minimum, what was the weather like that day?
Yeah.
or if it's indoors, what kind of bulbs is it under?
Yeah.
Just one of those two things can completely change.
I mean, if
the
you're
colour.
building US Navy aircraft in light gold grey and white, like I do, that light
Yeah.
gold grey, the shade of that just varies dramatically from photograph to photograph. So what's the point in me getting overly fussy about it? I pay lip service to colour accuracy. As long as it looks good enough to me, then I'm happy.
I mean, you're not going to paint it a different color. You're not going to paint it like Russian grey.
No.
You're going to try and do a light gold grey, but a light gold grey is good enough.
Yeah, definitely.
You focus on the machines more than the human element. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's definitely the case. And I also think it's almost to some degree inevitable with aircraft. I think introducing the human element into aircraft is very difficult. And if, like me, you've said, well, aircraft are the thing, even if I decided to change direction, I think aircraft are incredibly difficult to incorporate into meaningful dioramas because, especially a lot of the aircraft which I'm interested in post-war, so a lot of jets, the number of situations you can put them in is extremely limited. A tornado exists on a runway, in a hangar, maybe in a museum, and if one crashed, it probably wasn't intact. Or flying, obviously. But so there's very little you can do, in my opinion, to introduce human elements into that.
I'm going to get in trouble now, but I think aircraft dioramas are inherently boring because there is so little you can do with it.
Yeah, for that reason, and to make them interesting, you have to do something a bit different. So that's why I think seaplanes are quite common in dioramas because you can put a seaplane in a number of different environments and do something interesting with it. Whereas if you're making a tornado, to introduce the human element to that, to do something which hasn't been done before or which is interesting is almost impossible. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm saying I certainly don't possess the creativity or interest in doing it. In an ideal world, they would all be flying because I think they look fantastic flying, but that's impractical for me.
Well, flying is kind of the natural state of an aircraft, isn't it? It's like a bird. A bird perched on a branch is kind of attractive, but it's not the same as seeing a bird in flight.
Yeah, I mean, to say something controversial myself, because I almost thought about writing an article about this, is like I am very anti-base. I do not like bases in my models. I can enjoy them in other people's models, but I have no interest in putting my models on bases for aesthetic reasons.
Do you mean any kind of base?
Yeah, any kind of base. So for me,
or scenic base?
no, for me, the idea, any base to me is a distraction. For me, the idea, that's why I like them on a white background or a plain background. This is purely aesthetics. And that's a very strange position to take, I know. And I'm sure lots of people might listen to that and go, well, he's just making post hoc justifications for being lazy or lacking ambition or something like that. And maybe that's true, but I don't think I'm kidding myself. I think it genuinely is the case.
The thing is, I can kind of understand that at home because on a shelf, fine, not a problem. But at a show, I really cannot stand seeing a model perched on the cloth on the table.
Yeah, I mean, Ian McGonigal, from the Four Corners Modelling Club, he was giving me some feedback on a helicopter model I put in at Telford a couple of years ago, and he said it's a really good model, but if you would put it on a base, I think he would have done much better. And he then offered to make me a base so that when I went to SMC last year, I could put it on. Yeah. And I can't have someone make a base for me. That's a step too far. So I took a base and I did put them on a base. But for me, it's through gritted teeth. I really do want.
It's just not your thing.
To me, the lines of the base or the edges are a distraction. I want to kind of perceive not the silhouette, but the shape stand out against a plain background. That's just what I like.
Do you think, even if there's not a human on it, do you think there is a reflection of the human in a miniature machine? I mean, there's a seat in the thing, for one thing. It at least references it.
Yeah, and I have no interest in making unmanned aircraft, for example. Drone, I'm not going to make a model of a drone. So for some inexplicable reason, the human element is important to me. I can't quite pin down what that is or why that is. In some ways, the human element of military aircraft is a point of tension for me because they are objects of war and they are objects of destruction. Now, I do build some which are trainers, they're much more benign, but nevertheless, the overall theme is military. And I'm a very non-violent person. I do a confrontational job, but I don't carry a taser. Police officers in this country, the vast majority, don't have guns. I have a strong bent in that direction. And in an ideal world, for me, these machines wouldn't exist, and I suppress that kind of tension, to be honest, and because I'm not sure much rides on it. I don't think it matters that much that I find a bit of conflict in between the nature of what it is I am modelling and the model. It's not like I am building actual killing machines. But nevertheless, it is a point of tension that the human element of a lot of these machines is kind of born out of quite a negative context.
I think most people don't think about it. I think this also applies when people talk about the subjects we build, unless it's something that's involved in a current conflict, which I think then it's going to automatically have a resonance that implies some sort of identification with one side or the other. But like, for instance, German World War II, people say, well, it makes you a Nazi if you must be interested in Nazi stuff if you build German World War II. Most people don't make any connection between the subject and the history.
Yeah.
Not in terms of their motivation for building it. I built a HE-111 a few years ago for Sam from ICM.
Yes.
And I thought about a lot of things while I was building that. I thought about how cool the splinter camo was and how to get that to look right. I thought about detailing the interior. I thought about how I broke the machine guns every time I touched the flipping thing. But one thing I didn't think about was Adolf Hitler or the Luftwaffe or Hermann Goering or something. It just didn't occur to me. And some people might say it should do, but I don't think anyone builds machines of war thinking that killing people is a cool thing. If you see what I mean. It's just a cool object.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Just to be clear, I'm not making that connection myself. But I am.
No, I'm saying because it sounds like you don't. You don't think about them really as killing machines because it's just a cool shape.
It is, and the HE-111 is a great example because the front of that aircraft is just unique. What they did with the design of it. It doesn't have a nose in the traditional sense.
That weird greenhouse with the off-center asymmetric, machine gunners or whatever.
I may build a Spanish post-war one day, but I don't have plans to build one, but I do think it looks cool. I just think it looks cool, the front of that aircraft.
There's that Russian big bomber that's got a glass nose as well. That's cool.
Some do. B-29 also the same. Yeah. Their front, things which are different like that and stand out.
I like a greenhouse.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't because of the masking, but they look good when you get it right. Why do you think it is that we make these miniature things? What is it that it gives us to make tiny little versions of stuff?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this question because you've been asking it of quite a few people, and I asked this at the dinner table last night. I got 2 teenage daughters and my wife, and my eldest daughter, she's in lower 6th and she's doing like philosophy and psychology and theology and Latin and these things. She's very plugged into the philosophical world, and her instant answer was power. She's like, you're doing it for power, the sense of power. And I thought, that's really interesting. That's a very postmodern response, I think, from her. And we had a really interesting discussion about it. I have a much more romantic answer, I think, which is, for me, it's about closing the viewer-object gap. So when I like hill walking. I was a geologist. You go up on mountains, you go to the Alps, you look down, and there's just that sense of grandeur of seeing that scenery, and it's a bit mind-blowing. But at the same time, it's also a bit discomforting because you feel like you're an observer and you can't enter into it. You're looking down the valley.
You're removed.
You can't
by distance.
That's right. Yeah. So you're part of it, but you're also not part of it. You stand on top of a high mountain and look down at the small town in the valley and see things going on, and you want to reach out and touch it, but you can't. You're so far away from it. And I feel the same with these subjects which I model. I like the aesthetics of aircraft. I like the lines. I like the way they look. I find them captivating. But the only way I can see that is at a distance, because an aircraft is big. If you stand 3 feet away from an aircraft, you can only perceive a very small part of it. And modeling is what allows me to put my nose against something and perceive the whole of it, to feel a sense of intimacy with it because I'm physically close to it, and yet to be able to also perceive the whole. And I think that has really interesting implications for scale. 1/48 is where I've settled, but 1/6 scale, if they were making 1/6 scale aircraft, I'd find that incredibly boring. And people talk about that, don't they? Like the Action Man scale or those large action figures. I think they're 1/6 scale. You see people make dioramas with them and stuff. I actually find that really boring. I find it it's not aesthetically engaging at all. And I think it's to do with that. It's because it pushes it too far away from you. You want to get your nose up against it, in my opinion. So that, I think, is a really powerful driver for me, is that a sense of intimacy with the subject that allows me to be close to it. To get even more philosophical about it, and to take a risk here possibly, it made me think of something that Blaise Pascal wrote in one of his Pensées in it's 113. I looked it up, and he said, "Through space, the universe grasps me and swallows me up like a speck, but through thought, I grasp it." And there's this kind of dualism of human experience in the vastness of the universe, but the universe doesn't comprehend me, and yet these few pounds of grey matter in my head are able, in some very weird way, only through the power of thought, to grasp the universe and to comprehend it to some degree. There's this strange dualism that exists between our perception of what's in our head and our thoughts and the external world, and a massive asymmetry there. And humans deal with this in all kinds of ways, I think, this kind of mental material divide. And part of that, I think, is kind of getting worse with things like a move to everything being more online, which leads to a more disembodied engagement with the world to a degree. And that chasm may be widening, which is not always a blessing. So to go back to the mountain analogy, now I can see the view from the mountain on my screen, on the computer screen, which is not the same as going and seeing it in an embodied way in real life. And modelling is embodied. Modelling is in some way a connection with material, physical, created things, and it's an infinitesimal step towards wanting to enter into that which I am observing, as opposed to going in the other direction. Am I making any sense at all so far?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for bringing the philosophy to the model philosopher.
The eschatology of my tradition, where I come from and where I am, is represents that in things like the union of heaven and earth, or the union of the transcendent and the immanent, the coming together of these things. And I think the smallness of modelling, this is very strange, to connect something as trivial as modelling to something as important as what the meaning of life is, or what life is in total. But nevertheless, I think modelling moves me, as I said, in some very, very small way in that direction. The miniature sucks me in to a kind of a different world, a different experience of the world. And it does it purely by virtue of being miniature and nothing more than that. Yeah, I think what I said makes sense to me. Whether that makes sense to anyone else or not, I have no idea.
It's I'm going to have to listen to it again when I'm editing this, and then again when I put it out, because it's something I need to think about. I think you're onto something with the fact that it allows you to bring something which is notionally far away, because it's small, to you, if you see what I mean, to bridge the distance.
Yeah.
In a way you can't do in real life. I think I don't want to say too much, because one thing I don't like doing when I ask this question is to answer it myself, because I don't.
You're going to have to one day, Chris.
Yeah, when I put it all together into an episode, I will do. But but also, I'm not sure I really know, if you see what I mean. My mind's still very open as to why I do it. I do know, one thing I will say is, going back to what you're saying about you wouldn't ever build 1/6 aircraft, it's why I don't build 1/16 armour. 1/16 armour is really popular at the moment, but it does not interest me at all. If anything, I like to, for me, 1/35th is as big as I like to go, and I like to go smaller because I enjoy 1/700 scale as well.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that has occurred to me. I understand that because I've got to know John Murphy a little bit, and when I see his models at Telford and at SMC, and I get down on my knees and I put my nose against it, and because in 1/16 scale, the tank or the vehicle occupies about that space, the physical space, that you can get close to it and still perceive it. And so I can get sucked into it and I can appreciate it. But if it was in a diorama, I think I'd really struggle with that. because it just then becomes too big. You have to stand back too far. So I think the scale thing is not a hard and fast rule. It depends on what it is. But I agree that, I could see, I had the same thought when I was thinking this through earlier. 1/16 is probably really pushing the limit of what interesting
I
armor
mean,
would look like.
it's a different reason that I don't. I mean, it's not because I don't get the thing you get about being able to perceive it in the whole. It's just somehow, and I can't even describe how it is. For me, somehow it loses the illusion when it gets to 1/6. The bigger it gets, the more it loses the illusion, which is ironic because, of course, the closer it gets to the real scale, the less the less I can maintain the illusion. But I don't know what. I'll have to have a good think about it.
Yeah,
Maybe summing up I do after interviews at the end of the show.
Certainly, what I've said
by then.
is not pretending to answer anything. I hope to offer it as a potential for exploration, really, and maybe it will be a dead end. I don't know.
I mean, a lot of people do say it's control, and I can understand that to a certain extent. In that, when we're modelling, it's something we have complete control over, whereas the rest of our lives we don't. But I don't. I think there's also a temptation to, as you say, think about that in the postmodern negative sense, that it's about power over something when it isn't. I don't think that's at all what it's about. But I don't know. I think there's different answers for everybody. Basically,
it's a fascinating question, and I mean, I can understand the control. I don't personally feel that that's something. I feel often out of control. I feel that my materials are not within my control. Like paint is not always doing what I'm wanting it to do. Glue, especially, is not always doing what I'm wanting it to do. I think
it always goes where you don't want it.
Whenever I close my canopies, which I used to think would make my life easier. Actually, closing canopies just makes your life a lot harder in the same way.
Far riskier for a fogging.
Yeah. And fogging, that's right. You take the masking off and there's some fogging inside and you can't do anything about it anymore.
Or a bit of dust.
Or the dust. It's like, oh my word, that is well out of my control. So I always feel at the mercy of the modelling gods. I don't feel in control at all.
Well, at least you have to dust cockpits.
Yes, fair enough. Although, as I said, in some sense, modelling is trivial. In another sense, it's very integral to who a lot of us are, and it's finding. I don't want to make it more important than it is. It's not life or death, but neither do I want to devalue it and say it's disconnected from who we are.
Well, there's a tension in it which we don't talk about nearly enough because people do treat it like it's, in a sense, like it's far more important than it is. But at the end of the day, we're guys making little plastic toys, basically, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
It's not, like you say, it's not like
trying to honour it properly.
But at the same time, it's not that trivial either. It is something that's important to us. Otherwise, I wouldn't spend hours talking to people and recording it, and people wouldn't listen to it. It's more important than we think it is, and less important than we think it is at the same time.
Well, if you ever want a reality check, I was out with my family last week, and I was saying, I'm really trying to avoid getting sucked into this argument on Facebook where people are getting quite abusive to each other and they're blocking each other and they're getting very heated and emotional. And so my wife said, so what's it about? And I said, it's about whether you should dip your canopies in polish or not. And they're just like, everyone else in my family just absolutely breaks up laughing. Just like, that's hilarious. That's something which you're trying to, but it sucks us in, doesn't it? We get very, and I'm not saying these things are not important and they're not good fun sometimes, but it was fun to see their reaction to it. And so just to wrap up on everything we've said in that sense, I can't underline enough how important I think it is that modelers should be comfortable in their own skin and know what it is that they want to do and do that. That's why I get a bit jaded on podcasts when people ask questions about, how do I improve my productivity, or how do I do this, or how do I do that, or I've got a problem with Mojo. I don't believe in Mojo personally, but people are often saying, what's the solution to my problem? And those questions are interesting and they're valid. I'm not saying they're not, but I think often the answers won't satisfy you because in order to know what the right answer for you is, you probably need to understand yourself first and what it is that you're actually trying to do and want to do. Otherwise, you just get advice which doesn't work. If someone came to me and said, John, you'd be such a better modeler if you painted a bust or made a car, and that may technically be true, but I have no interest in that. So why would I do it? Yeah, that's right.
I think you've hit on something there when people say, what should I do about this? How should I do it? Well, a lot of the time it's because they're not really knowing themselves and what they want to do and how they want to do it. And, because a lot of the time you see the same answers come out again and again, repeated again and again, and they end up picking one which chimes with what they wanted. I suppose what they're really doing is asking people to help them sort out their own thoughts. Because when it comes down to it, you're not going to take someone else's advice unless it confirms how you feel about it.
That's very fair. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I'm doing pretty well in terms of, you could say I'm a mature modeler. If I was 2 years into this, I would not be talking like this. Yeah. And that's just an accident of history. There's no value in judgment in that. That's just the way things turned out.
One thing I wanted to ask you, John, because I think in this internet age or this connected age where we go to shows and everything else and talk to other modelers and see what they're doing, we're inspired a lot by other people. Maybe not directly, we don't copy their work, but it feeds into our work. So who do you look at? Who do you admire? You've mentioned a couple of names already, but who else can we talk about?
Yeah, well, I will mention them again. Yeah. The people who I look up to, who I aspire to, who are ahead of me, some cases a long way ahead of me. John Chung is at the top of the list for me. And I know I've got to know John quite well, and we communicate about a lot of the things which we've spoken about, actually, at a fairly philosophical level. And that's a very precious thing to me. But his modelling, the book which has just come out by the Japanese publisher, whose name I forget. Yeah, just astonishing. And if he's the one who is always pushing me. There will be limits to that because, as I said, I'm not willing to trade 5 models a year for one. But it's always good to be thinking, even at the level at which I'm doing it, how can I do it that little bit better so that it looks like John Chung would have done it? So he's kind of at the top of the list. But very close to that also is Paul Budzig, who I think also really models for the subject. And I've corresponded a little bit with over the years, and is a very generous man. And I am in awe of his model making skills, but also appreciate the philosophy that he brings to it as well. Fanch Lubin, of course, just makes incredible stuff. I think you know John Kunak Tabanor. Yeah. I never actually know how to pronounce his surname. Love his models, and he's very brave in doing the kind of modelling I do, but also pushing the conversion aspects or the scratch building aspects. He really bite off some significant things. So he's really good.
He's very understated because he does really pretty impressive things, and he does them in a very matter-of-fact way. Which belies kind of how complex they are sometimes and how much skill he's got.
Yeah, he does some significant conversion work and does it very, very well and makes it look effortless, as you say. There's a chap called Roger Jackson who I don't know, who I aspire to because I don't know how much, it's 20 years ago, he put models on Modelling Madness, and they're still up there. I checked today on the website. His rescribing, which he did with an X-Acto knife, is otherworldly. You want to see a monogram F101 Voodoo rescribed, and it looks like it was moulded like that from a factory. John Chung is a master rescriber, absolutely. But Roger Jackson, absolutely amazing craftsmanship. Chris Sieber, of course. Yeah, Chris Sieber, Lufraum 72. Wonderful stuff. Matthias Becker, again, I don't know who he is, but I see his stuff around, and I think the tonal variety he has in his paint finishes are something I really aspire to. I'd love to know how he does that.
He did that.
Pascal Klaasen.
Did Matthias do that Dora Wings kit recently?
Yes.
Beaver, was it?
Beaver.
Yeah, that was phenomenal.
He gets a granularity in his paint finish, which I can't figure out how he does.
But it really,
as far as I'm aware, he hasn't written his methods down anywhere.
It really creates that illusion, doesn't it? That granularity. It's a very sort of scale thing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, the depth, it produces really good depth, and I'm impressed by that. And his photography is really good as well. Usually, he often puts them like on I don't know what it is, but like a water puddle reflection kind of base.
Right.
And I think it looks quite nice. Pascal Klaasen is a modeler as well. I really like. He often does things like F16s and stuff. Very good output on Facebook. And then there's a model. Again, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but his name is Kuba Klodek or something that. Because I believe he does a podcast. I think in Polish. Is that right?
Yeah, he does it with a couple of other guys who are also really good.
Yeah, I missed meeting him at SMC last year. I'd love to have met him because his work also is of a very high standard and the finishes are very complex. in a way which I really aspire to. So I think that's something which, as we talked about, the neatness, but also the complexity and the granularity and the tonality of the finish is something which I would like to have courage to grow into more.
Are you going to Scale Model Challenge this year?
Yeah, the plan is to definitely go. I've taken leave. It's barring some unforeseen circumstances, I should be there.
Yeah, fantastic. I booked my flight this morning. Not that I'm looking forward to it or anything. It's 8 months away, but I had the money. It's cheap if you book early, so that's what I did. I believe hotel rooms are going to open beginning of May, something like that. So keep an eye out for that, everybody.
Well, I run a really tight budget. So this year I stayed in some dormitory about 5 kilometres away. It was like I felt like I was in East Germany or something. It was just this concrete kind of bunker in the woods in like a 1970s building. I'll probably stay there again. I had 6 bunk beds to myself. It was really cheap.
Oh, fantastic! Hey, it's about being at the show. It's not about.
I need somewhere to sleep.
Well, you're not going to spend all your time in your room, so
don't need anything else. No, that's right. Yeah,
fantastic. Well, I look forward to seeing you there, Jon. Where can people find your work online, and where can they find more about sort of how you approach modelling?
Yep. So I do have a website, which is jonbyron.com, which sounds very self-indulgent, doesn't it? But
it does what it says on the tin, right?
Yeah. And I'm fortunate enough to have a very rare surname, so it was easy to get a domain name. Everything's written on there. I've got loads of photographs. I replicate a lot of that on Facebook at, I think it's Jon Byron's Scale Models or something. Again, if you just look up my name, it's an unusual name and it's easy to find me. Those are the 2 main places.
Are you on Instagram?
No, I'm not on anything else. I mean, I do have an account, but Instagram has square photos. Is that right?
Yes, pain in the arse, isn't it? Especially with aeroplanes, because you have to basically chop a photo in half and expect people to swipe to see the other half. It's a nightmare for aircraft. And if you fit it into the square, it's too small. So same with ships, same problem.
That's right. I haven't got time for that. And I do get published every so often in Scale Aircraft Modelling, which for other reasons which we didn't have time to explore, is a magazine I rather like.
Yeah. Now, that's not to be confused with SAM Publications, by the way. A lot of people do that. Scale Aircraft Modelling is a magazine from Guideline, who are good guys. So definitely worth picking that one up.
That funds my hobby at the moment, so I'm very grateful for that. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It sounds very strange. It's going to sound very fanboyish, but I was immensely excited and surprised by your invitation. And as I said, I've got other things I should be doing in my life right now, but the last 2 days, I've just been thinking pretty much about this. So I hope that I managed to get what I wanted to say across in a coherent enough way that it's sufficiently interesting to listen to.
As I said, I think at the start of this interview, I want this show to be about different ideas, and you've certainly brought lots of ideas and lots of deep thinking about the way you approach modelling, and I really do appreciate that. Thank you, Jon.
Well, thank you for asking questions in a way which made them very easy to do that.
That was a very, very interesting conversation for me. When I started this podcast, I wanted it to be a forum for different modelers who think deeply about their craft to present their ideas, and I hoped they would come at it from very different points of view. Jon certainly brought that, and like all the guests I've had on, he thinks about it very deeply and communicates his thoughts in a compelling way, which, as always, has left me with a lot to think about. Although I believe in storytelling modelling, I can really appreciate his point of view. In a sense, it's minimalist, reducing the model to its essence rather than making it a part of a larger something else. And when we reduce an idea to its essence, it can appear clearer and more focused. If it says less than a story, it means it has to say it very well to be compelling and attractive to the eye, and that in itself can be a very difficult challenge in its own way. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so please do write into info@insidethearmour.com and tell me what you think, or leave your thoughts on this episode in the Model Philosophers Lounge group on Facebook. Remember, you can leave a review for this podcast on your podcast app of choice, and I hope you do, as it helps others to find the show. Thanks as always to our fantastic patrons. If you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/themodelphilosopher. Thank you most of all for your attention and for your time and for following The Model Philosopher. I really do appreciate you all. Take care.